The Seed Savers Orchard was started about 1989, and there was about 750 varieties of apples planted, and now that number is probably over 1,100 different varieties. And one of the types of apples we are specializing in, among others, of course, are cider varieties. Due to their popularity these days, cider apples are very hard to get a hold of, and they have some interesting characteristics. But we're going to talk about a lot of different things today, so I hope to cover a fair bit of ground and can't wait to answer some of your questions. As far as the kind of apples you can use for cider, the best thing that you can possibly do is have as many different kinds as possible. The one thing that is good to know that apples typically that you find at most orchards are going to be dessert varieties, which tend to be a little bit of acidic. So you would like to balance those with apples that are sweeter and have some other characteristics. Traditional cider apples are fairly high in sugar, and they have characteristics of being bittersweet or bitter sharp, which means they have tannins that give it character and body. When you ferment this sugar off most dessert apples, there isn't much left. There isn't much background flavors. So what you want to do is to add different varieties that pick up where those left off and add those components. Tannins and phenolics and things are those really great characteristics that give your cider much better taste. You'll see on your screen that there's a picture of our current orchard. This is the old orchard that was planted originally in '89, and you can see there's quite a bit of trees there. And we have also a collection of grapevines. They were the breeding grapes from Elmer Swenson of Minnesota, who was trying to breed Northern Hardy wine grapes, and we do have quite a bit of his collection that's still there. And so the diversity of this orchard is an amazing thing to see. And at this time of the year, it's absolutely just a blast to come in and walk up and down the rows and sample all the different types of apples. And you can go from tree to tree to tree, and you will probably never find two apples that taste exactly alike. And that's what the joy of it is. The diversity at this orchard is something that you're not going to see just everywhere. And so if you have the ability to come to an orchard like this and sample, I think you'll find, you'll learn what apples that you like. And that's really the biggest component part of the cider you like to make, is the different types of apples and what you like as far as eating and or for being able to make cider with. But traditionally, cider apples, of course, have those bittersweet, bitter sharp aspects that give your taste and flavor of your ciders really something. But if you don't have those available, you can try to choose just a nice mix, some sweet apples, some tart apples, ones that are very rich in sugars, and typically russet apples are some of the best single varietals that you'll probably likely find. So I recommend that you look for russet apples anywhere you can. They're not necessarily easy to get, but if you can find a source for those, I think you'll be real pleased on what they can do. This is part of our new orchard complex that we're going to be building in the next few years. We've started planning it already, but we're going to showcase a lot of varieties that are very classic to the upper Midwest, varieties that are adaptable to this particular area, and those that have a long history here. And so we're really excited to bring this into production in the next few years. And from here, we hope to be able to show anybody that comes by just the amazing diversity that apples are. There are so many different kinds. I've documented over the years a long amount of apples that have originated in this country from the 1600s to about the year 2000. And that number is around 17,000 different kinds. And it's amazing to know why there are so many different types. Apples are heterozygous, which means that their genetic structure is such that there is a dominant and recessive gene, and when those meet, they in the pollination process, they match in all different ways. And so you'll have very small apples, large apples, sweet, tart, sour, everything in between. And the old adage is every apple plants an orchard. And if you were to take seeds out of a particular apple and plant it in the ground, every seed that you plant can end up being a different variety at some point in time that with very different tastes. And so to keep these varieties alive, we have to vegetatively propagate them, which means take a cutting, graft it onto another root. And so we have apples in the collection that date back to 450 AD, which is pretty early. That particular variety was a Maladesio, also known as Dacio, and it was named after a Roman general who was chasing Attila the Hun through the mountains, and this is an apple they kept with him because it stored well and it traveled well. And so it's been kept alive all these generations for the fact that somebody took a cutting of it, grafted it onto a tree, and kept doing that generation after generation to keep this variety alive. That's a little unusual. Most things that we have here have originated in the mid-1800s, and we try to concentrate a lot of the varieties in our orchard to those that originated prior to about 1920 or so, which is a huge amount. We're always continually finding old varieties. One apple that I was really thrilled to find some years ago was an apple by the name of plum cider, and we'll have a picture of that coming up before long. But that's a nice apple to have. The thing to do is to get out and try as many different apples as you can find. Try to find as good a mix as you can possibly put together, and this is going to give your character of your cider so much better than just a single type. But basically, whatever you can get your hands on. It isn't really specific. Traditional English cider apples are typically very small in size. They look more like crab apples than regular apples, and so you have to pick tons of them to be able to get a bushel even to make cider with. So I don't necessarily recommend that you go out and look for traditional English and French cider apples, but find anything that you can get a hold of and try to make a good mix of it, and it should be perfectly fine. There's a picture of that plum cider. It's a particularly nice apple and pretty juicy, and it originated in Milton, Wisconsin, which isn't too far from here. If you are going to make your own cider, one option, of course, is to go to your local orchard and buy whatever sweet cider they have made and take it home and use that. That's perfectly fine. Now, I used to press cider for upwards of a dozen different orchards over the years, and everyone had their own mix of apples, and so you would get to know the kind of blends that they would make. And so it was kind of interesting to see the different sweet apples and the different sharp apples and stuff to give it that really well-rounded characteristic. And of course, what they were making was sweet cider. And by having a very good quality sweet cider, it just naturally lends itself to having a very good hard cider in the process. This press here is a very old press that was donated to us by the Pfister family, and it's a lovely one. It has a double tub, and it has a crusher on the top. But what we find out with this type of press, and you can certainly use them, they're still efficient and they still work, is that the crusher typically breaks the apples up into large pieces. And to really be more efficient about how you extract juice from that, you should try to mash your apples up as fine as possible. Not quite to a sauce, but darn near close to it. You will find that you get better yields from your juice, and it works a lot better. So we don't use that particular crusher. We have an electric grater that works really well. This is the very old way of making apple cider. Back in about the 17 and 1800s, they would use a big stone wheel like this that was pulled around in a circle by a horse. You would dump your apples into a trough like this, and it would mash up the apples, and it would come out of a little port out of the side of the trough. And so these are extremely rare. This one is in England, but it's a lovely example of the old way that they used to do that. I couldn't imagine having stone chips in your cider, but that would be what happens there. This is a more modern type press. This is a homemade unit that has a very large heavy metal screw at the top, and that's what you can put your cross pieces in it and turn it to get it tight. This type of press is fairly efficient because it looks like you can get pretty good pressure on that. So there are lots of home presses out there in the market now, and you can look for those. You can find typically old antique cider presses that are still functional, but consider about trying to mash your apples up a little bit finer. There's some different techniques for doing it. Look online, there's lots of sources out there, but a motorized grinder is probably the one thing that you can do to make your efficiency much better. What these type of cider presses do, this is typically a rack and cloth type press. There's a cloth layer, and there's a form that sits on top of the wood trays that are there, and you fill that pulp into the bag, and then you close the top over it, and then you put another layer on, and you build up what they call a cheese. When it's full, then you can keep pressing it down. Cider pressing is kind of a slow process. The press I used to run dated back to 1913, and it was had hydraulic cylinder on it, and I could build up about 35 tons pressure. So it was around 1,300 psi. A press like the one in this picture is probably only going to get to about 100 psi. Much different, much less. And so what you need to do if you have a press like this is to squeeze it down, let the juice run off, squeeze it again, let the juice run off until you collect enough, until your cake is what's left over in the bag is pretty dry. And so you've got most of the extraction out of it that you can possibly get. A press, of course, will take the pulp, and the only way of straining it, of course, is the mesh diameter of the bag. A juicer, I think, is going to be more of an extraction system, and it may be a finer product. You lose a lot of the little bits in it. And so I've never used an extractor, frankly, and a typical grinder is just fine. It depends what you have access to. That's the main thing. Whatever you have, certainly use it. I know some people that converted an old garbage disposal, hopefully cleaned, and runs their apples through that. It's not perfect, and unfortunately some of the russet apples are fairly dry, and so they tend to clog up in those kind of systems. Having a fairly open grater grinder is probably going to be able to process those kind of apples much better. Typically juicy ones aren't going to be an issue either way. Macintosh, for one example, is one of the easiest apples to press. It's very soft flesh, and it's very sloppy actually when it comes out of a juicer. I have long experience being splattered with Macintosh pulp. But if you use like a golden russet or a Ribston Pippin with a drier flesh, typically it comes out like cornflakes. The difference is amazing, but you still can extract almost as much juice out of it. It just takes a little bit more effort. The one thing is that what you have to have, you don't need a lot of equipment for making hard cider. It doesn't take much, but a couple of key things to have is going to be either a refractometer or a hygrometer. Hygrometer is going to be less expensive, and you can find them almost anywhere. What it does, it tests the specific gravity of your juice. And what you need to find out is the potential alcohol level that this juice can present. What you're looking for is shelf life. You need to have enough sugars in your juice that it will produce at least 6 or 7% alcohol by volume. That will allow your cider to be made and stored without deteriorating and spoiling, and you don't want that. Typically, we're looking for a specific gravity of around 1055 to 1065 is a good range. And so what you need to find out is when you make your juice, you need to test the specific gravity to find out what it is. And so there's a kind of a quick rule of thumb is if you need to raise the specific gravity to get within those parameters, typically the easiest thing to add is just plain cane sugar. It actually gives a cidery taste to cider, and it works really well. You can use brown sugar, but it kind of overpowers your cider, and it may not be the most pleasant to flavor for you. Honeys are fine. That when you put honey into a cider, that product is typically called a Cider, and if you see it in the stores, you'll know what it is. That means there's honey added to it. Honey is a little trickier to use to get it right, and it does impart an interesting kind of a mead-like flavor to it, which is very pleasant. Ciders are a really lovely beverage. But cane sugar is the simplest to use. You can dissolve some in water, but if you need to raise, say, your gravity tests out at, say, 1047, and you want to raise it up about 20 degrees, you typically will have to add at least 1 cup of sugar to raise it those 20 degrees. And that's 1 cup per gallon. So in a 5-gallon carboy, which is a very typical fermenter, you will need to have about 5 cups of sugar. And if you want to play around with the alcohol volume a little bit, there are lots of tables online that can tell you at what degree, a specific gravity, what potential alcohol that you will have there. Now that's only if you ferment it till it's completely dry, that there is no residual sugars left. And that's important. So your basic equipment for fermenting is going to be a carboy. I recommend glass, but there are some nice polyethylenes that work pretty well. They tend to have issues as far as getting oxygen into your system. Glass is just a very easy product to work with, and if you don't mind handling it and are careful with it, it will last you a very long time. And after, what you need is going to be a cork for the top that has a small hole in it that you can put an airlock in it. This will keep out any air. Oxygen is completely detrimental to cider. The picture that you have on your screen now is a typical 5-gallon carboy with a cork, white cork on top, and that's one type of fermentation lock that you can put on there. It has water in it, and it allows CO2, which is your byproduct of the fermentation process, is to bubble out and not have air get into it and spoil the system. There are different types. There's sort of the typical S-curve type that you see everywhere. This particular kind here is much easier to clean. What you will have when you add yeast to this, you will have a very initial vigorous fermentation. and that sometimes can be a real mess. And so you'd like to have a backup, or what you can do is to put a tube into the hole in your cork and just have it dump into a bucket of water. And the vigorous fermentation will then blow off really fast, and then you can replace, when it slows down, this type of airlock back into the cork, and it works really fine. Otherwise, you're going to have foam and stuff blow all over the top of this, and you probably should have it in a place where it's got a tray under it or something to catch it. It can be a mess. Sometimes it's not so bad. Fermentation is a fun process to see, especially in the glass carboys, because it just swirls and swoons around. It's fun, kind of fun to see. And I mentioned yeast. Now I need to get into that discussion a little bit. There are different types of yeast to put in your ciders to help them work and do their thing. You don't necessarily have to put any kind of a cultured commercial yeast in your cider. You can actually use the natural yeast that are within the apples. Some people will say, oh, if you really wash the apples hard, that yeast is gone. That's typically on the skins of the fruit, but that's not the case. Yeast cells are actually all through the fruit, and they're just waiting their turn to work. You can have the typical New England farmhouse barrel cider, which you will have to depend on what yeasts are on it. Saccharomyces strain is one of the ones that does the most job. There are lots of wild yeasts everywhere, and a lot of the wild yeasts are very alcohol sensitive. And so after a degree or two, or a percent or two of alcohol, I should say, those wild yeasts are killed off. And so typically it's the hardier strains that will then ferment all the way down. The commercial cultivated yeasts I like to use those for the fact that you put basically a large inoculum into your mix, and so it overpowers the wild yeast and takes over, and it gives you a more controlled type of fermentation, which is a good thing. There are many different kinds. One of my favorites, I have three actually. My three favorites are Pasteur Champagne. The next one is Premier Cuvée, and lastly it's one called EC 1118. It only goes by a number. These three are widely available at almost any homebrew shop, and I'm sure you can find them online. They give good quality to your cider. They are very alcohol tolerant. They will ferment to 18 or 20% almost, which is pretty high. And they're just really bomb-proof. They're really wonderful. So I recommend a controlled type of yeast if you really want to try it and have results that I think you can depend on. If you go with the natural yeasts that are on it, I think that's something in maybe a few years of making your own ciders to get a feel for that and try it out. Typically a package of yeast is a little over $1, and so it's not expensive. There are liquid type yeast that you can use. There's a liquid cider yeast that I've seen in the stores, but last price I looked at it was around $6 or $7. So it starts getting a little spendy. If you want to save yourself some money, certainly the dry package yeasts are fine. The way to mix that is to put it in a little bit of warm water and let those yeast cells start to come alive, and then you pitch it into your carboy of cider and let it go. The results will be within a few days. It will be very vigorous. Fermentation in your juice is something that is a little bit different depending on where you get your apples from. Apples from most commercial orchards are well fertilized, and so there's a lot of nitrogen compounds in that cider, and so your fermentation is going to be fairly vigorous and much quicker. Apples that have been gathered from, say, wild trees where they don't get fertilized have lower nitrogen levels, and they will make actually a better fermentation. Slow fermentation is a good thing. We don't want to make this really fast. An ideal temperature to have your cider, if you can possibly get it, is around 65 degrees. That's a good temperature. It'll work higher, it'll work lower, but a slow fermentation really gives the benefit of the yeast cells. And so that's something I think you can try to do. Find a spot in your basement. It's a good place to do it, or some room that doesn't get too much heat from any source, and it allows you to control it just a little bit better. And so there are other types of yeast that work just fine as well. Ale yeasts are one I've used in the past, and they give good results. The interesting thing about each type of yeast is that it gives it a little bit different characteristic and a little bit different flavor. And so by experimenting, you can find those that you find that you tend to like. Troubles in cider. Ciders have lots of aromatic compounds in them. And I'm going to go through here, find my list. There are hundreds of compounds within your cider. The aromatic compounds are something that are kind of nice. You've got fusel alcohols, which would be, one of the types is phenethyl alcohol, which gives you kind of a rose-like aroma. There are various esters in your cider. Amyl acetate will give that sort of smell of pear drops, so that real sweet pear scent. And there's volatile phenolics. Ethyl phenol gives it your cider a sort of a spicy tone. And then there's aldehydes, like acetaldehyde, which is sort of a bruised apple sort of a smell. And then there are ketones, which one of the types is diacetyl, which gives it sort of a butterscotch tone. And then there are dioxanes, which are other compounds that give it a real cidery aroma. And so the thing is, sometimes the parts per million of these are very, very small, but if they're not in balance, they can present some really strange issues. Certain types of yeast, I'll back up talking about yeast, is you don't typically like to use a red wine yeast because you can create a lot of sulfur dioxide compounds, and that gives it that rotten egg smell, and that's not a pleasant thing to have in cider. You want to avoid that if at all possible. I'll talk only a little bit about malolactic fermentation. That's something you run into in homemade ciders. Malolactic fermentation is the little bacteria that will change malic acid, which is the main acid component in your apples, to lactic acid. And in some cases, when you have very acidic apples, i.e. dessert apples, malolactic fermentation can actually reduce the acidity and make your cider a much more pleasant product. And so depending on what you have available, this is something that may be something you might want to look into in the future. You'll find out that very acidic fruit will make very acidic cider because once the sugars are removed from the cider in the fermentation process, that sugar acid balance is changed. And so you'd like to probably have apples that don't have quite as much acid to give it that balanced flavor, which is really fun. So your fermentation is going to be initially very vigorous, and then it's going to slow down quite a bit. And so once you're able to put back the stopper back onto it, you like to leave a little bit of headspace when you first pour it in, not quite fill it with the full 5 gallons of liquid if that's what you're using, being a 5-gallon carboy. And so you reserve a little bit of sweet cider and let that initial vigorous fermentation blow off. And then as it's settled down, you can pour more of your raw cider back into it and fill your container. What you're trying to do is remove as much airspace as possible from your carboy. Air is just bad news, and that's where you tend to get vinegary compounds that sometimes can spoil your cider. It's one of those things that you just kind of want to avoid. One of the other things to consider, of course, is the sanitation of your equipment. That is something I know I'm skipping around in the order, but that's something I guess first and foremost I should probably have addressed. Sanitation is very important. You just need to have good, clean equipment. All your bottles are cleaned and washed out. There are different types of sanitizers you can use. Hot water, of course, is really great. Very hot water or steam if you have that, but if you don't, I've used just plain chlorine bleach. There are strips you can buy to test the amount of chlorine that's in a solution. And so you're looking for about 75 to 100 parts per million to get good effective sanitation. And restaurant supply stores typically sell those in little vials, and you can probably find them online. And that'll allow you to monitor your chlorine levels. Chlorine is a volatile product, and when you buy it in the store, it's at a set level. But depending on how it's stored, heat and sunlight will deteriorate the effectiveness of chlorine, and it will make it weaker, and you won't know if you had a good sanitation or not. That's not the only product to use. Chlorine is very aggressive, especially in certain metals. Stainless steel, it doesn't bother too much unless it's a lower quality stainless, like a 400 grade compared to a 300 grade. Most people won't know what that is, but if you look at online, there is a difference. There's more iron compared to nickel, and so it is rustable, and you can really mess up some equipment. Cider should really never come in contact with anything iron, with anything copper, because it will add off compounds into your cider and cause spoilage. So certainly stay away from touching different metals. Plastics typically are just fine. You don't have to worry about that. There are also quaternary ammonia compounds that work really good. Some of them require a rinse afterwards, and a lot of them don't. You can just air dry them and they're perfectly fine to go. Chlorine, if it's not rinsed properly, can give you some residual off smells, and that's not necessarily pleasant. But if you wash with a solution of sodium hypochlorite, basically chlorine, bleach, and water, and then rinse it with some clean water afterwards, you don't have much issue with that at all. So you want to, your cider is going to slow down and it's going to slowly bubble. You can watch the airlock as the bubbles pass through it, and you wait. It takes a few months. I like to figure it takes a month or two for you to get your cider to be completely worked down. And what I'm talking about is fermenting all the sugar out of your cider. I know a lot of people like to have residual sweetness in your cider, and that presents a little bit of an issue, because if there are actual sugars in your cider yet, and you still have active yeast still working, it's going to keep working regardless whether you want it to or not. A couple of ways of getting rid of the yeast cells out of your cider is to do frequent racking. Racking is by taking the liquid off the top of the sludge that forms at the bottom of your carboy and to siphon it into a clean, sanitized container. By getting it off the lees, as they call it, you get rid of those dead yeast cells. So basically the yeast cells are down there decomposing. And if you leave it on there for a long time, you're going to have a lot of off flavor potential. And so by frequent racking, you will eliminate most of the yeast cells out of it, and you can have a fairly mildly sweet cider, which is lovely. The downside is if you want to have a naturally sparkling cider, you typically will add a priming sugar at the time of bottling, like you do beer. You will usually use about a half a cup of just cane sugar in a cup of water, boil it on the stove until it's all dissolved, and then you can pour that into your carboy, and then if you can bottle it right after that, bottle it, and it will in time naturally ferment back in the bottle. Very little, if any, commercial cider is made this way. Typically what they do is they ferment their juice down to a desired sweetness level. They will sterilize it using typically like Campton tablets or sodium metabisulfite and totally sanitize the yeast, and then they will bring it into a bright tank and force carbonate it. So most of the product you see in the grocery and stuff is a manipulated product. It's not a natural artisanal cider. And the thing that you can do is to make your own artisanal cider and not spend a ton of money in the process. And it's naturally carbonated in the bottle, and it's a wonderful beverage. It will be typically fairly dry. So if you like to have a cider that has some residual sweetness, there are a couple of things you can do. You can add a sweetener to it that is a non-fermentable. Lactose is a non-fermentable sugar that you can add to cider. You can give it sweetness, and it will be a little bit more pleasant flavored. Sometimes a very dry cider is not exactly the first thing everybody really likes. It's sometimes an acquired flavor, but it's very pleasant nevertheless. I love the dry crispness of it. I think to me, it's a very refreshing product. Now, you can add different things to cider to give it different flavors. We talked about using honey. That's great. You can use purees of other fruit types. One thing that I did some years ago is I added a lot of raspberry puree to one of my carboys, and it was really fun to do that. The downside of it is the pulp all collected at the top of the container. And one day I came to check my cider, and I found that the fermentation lock was gone, and a lot of the pulp was missing out of the container. And I wondered where it went. Then I looked up. On the ceiling of the room that I was fermenting was this huge splatter of raspberry pulp, which I left there just as a reminder to be careful with that sort of thing. It does happen. So it's kind of fun making cider. There's interesting things. But you can add peach juice to cider. You can add cinnamon and different spices. It's really a lot of fun. Be creative if you want. Learn to make a good cider all by itself, and then you can start to play around and find those flavor components that you like to put in. I sometimes rack no more than once. But typically, if you want to get rid of the yeast cells and I think to make a little bit clearer product, you will rack a couple of times. Probably not much more than that, because every time that you do that, you are exposing your cider to oxygen, and that can potentially cause some issues. So I try to do it as infrequently as possible. Okay. If you want the sweetness, that's going to be the one thing that you have to rack frequently and get those yeast cells off, and it'll leave you a sweet but somewhat still cider, meaning it's not carbonated. The fun thing to do, if you have access to a large number of apples like we do here, is then we can start playing around by doing single varietals, finding those varieties that we can ferment by themselves, and then sample them one at a time to see the kind of flavor components that are going into it. And so that's really a lot of fun to do. The picture you see here of some crab varieties, and crab apples are a really nice thing to mix into your cider because they are the type of apples that will give your cider wonderful character and body. There's a lot of really good books out on this subject. One of my favorites is called Craft Cider Making. It's a British publication. It's by Andrew Lee. It's fairly recent. It's a small little paperback, but it has lots of information. I think the interesting thing about cider making in general, you don't have to know a lot about what's happening to make good cider. But I think the more you do know, the more the chemistry and what happens in it, that you can tailor your cider to those tastes that you like to have. So the more you know, it's a good thing. But you can do this without having a background in chemistry or anything like that, because I certainly don't. I just made cider one time, and it turned out really well, and I loved it. And so I've just been hooked on it ever since. And from there, I've made literally thousands of gallons of cider, and I've learned to distill and make apple brandy, which is lots of fun. That's a whole nother subject, though. Okay, simplest thing is probably find some raw cider at a local orchard if you can. That's probably the easiest way to go. If you find it in the grocery store, it's typically been pasteurized, and so you may want to avoid that. You could add yeast to it and begin the fermentation process all over again. But if you have access to raw cider at an orchard, that's the first step. Get yourself a 5-gallon glass carboy, get a funnel, a good funnel, because you want to get that cider down in it and not splatter it all over, because they have a fairly small cork size. Pour the cider in, let it sort of, if it's been refrigerated, you want to let it bring up to temperature. At that point, you probably already tested your cider and you know what potential alcohol is there. Add enough sugar to get at least that 1065 level for shelf life. After that, dissolve a little bit of yeast in some water, pour it through the funnel into your cider, and put the cork in with the fermentation lock and just let it go. That's all you have to do. An efficient cider mill is going to, you're going to get about 3 to 3.5 gallons per bushel of cider. That's in a very efficient press. And so if you have a homemade press or one of those old antique hand crank press, it's going to take probably twice that. You're only going to get about half the efficiency. And so you're going to at least need about 7-8 bushels of apples, I think, to get probably a good 5-gallon carboy worth. But by finding a more efficient type of system, you will be able to get better yields for sure.